Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a design subcommittee meeting of the Boston Civic Design Commission. Share my screen. Today's date is Tuesday, November 26th. This is session A of the BCDC Design Subcommittee. The Planning Department continues hosting public meetings in a virtual setting for the health, safety, and accessibility of Boston residents. My name is Seth Reisman, Deputy Director of Design Review at the City of Boston Planning Department. Before we proceed with the agenda, the open meeting law requires that I notify the public that this meeting is being recorded. Therefore, please be aware that the commission staff is making an audio and video recording of this meeting. Please turn off your camera and microphone if you do not wish to be recorded. For the record, commissioners present include Commissioner Evans, Commissioner Love, Commissioner Ron, and Commissioner Solano. Tonight's agenda will include presentations for 22 Drydock Avenue, South Boston Waterfront, and 83 Leo Birmingham Parkway in Brighton. Tonight's meeting's proceedings will follow the typical BCDC subcommittee format, beginning with a brief presentation from the proponent, comments from BCDC commissioners, and then public testimony. A proposed project at 22 Drydock Ave in South Boston is seeking a notice of project change entitlement and contemplates the construction of a pedestrian bridge connecting the third floor of 22 Drydock Ave, aka Innovation Square Phase 3, and also known as LC2, to the third floor of 6 Tide Street, also known as LC1, over the Northern Avenue right-of-way. This will be the first presentation of the NPC to the BCDC Design Subcommittee following its introduction at the monthly meeting on November 12th, 2024. It is my understanding that there are no commissioners present who intend to recuse themselves from deliberations. A reminder to proponent teams that presentations will be limited to 15 minutes. I will give presenters a halftime and a 1-minute warning. With that, I invite the proponent team to begin presenting. But I do need to elevate you all, so please give me 1 second. Okay, I don't see Chuck on the call, but I believe I've elevated the other folks. I will stop sharing and invite the proponent team to start whenever they're ready.
Alex, I believe, Seth, sorry, I believe Alex is the, Chuck is on Alex's line under his name.
Got it. Thank you.
Great. Seth and commissioners, happy to present the presentation today. We're bringing that up right now. Class, can you do that? Great, fantastic. We last met on 11/12, and we had a wonderful presentation, great feedback. Let's go to the next slide. These are what we heard at 11/12, and I want to focus on next steps, which is in the far, lower right-hand corner, and that's essentially the agenda for today. What we've been asked to is to bring, a sense of scale and a scale comparison to a Liberty Mutual bridge, which you're going to see more metrics on that. We've been asked to look at alternative site studies that we brought to the table and we contemplated over the course of this design, materials, patterns, lighting enhancements, and how the bridge interacts with the public realm. You'll see that in a little bit more detail. The impacts of the visual corridor, how that has been thought about and resolved, in many ways. And then looking at some of additional artifacts and materials that we looked at, 3D modeling, which we used during the course of the design. We'll share with that today. You're going to see that in-depth thinking with that. And then last, what are the big drivers? What are the big ideas that have led to the design and the sense of beauty? Next. Just a little bit of the sense of context. The LC1 is existing. That's where Vertex Pharmaceutical is currently. LC2 is under construction, and the bridge is, in essence, connecting the two buildings, just to give you a little context on that. And next, just want Chuck to remind everyone the reason for the bridge.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Yeah, so just as a recap, we did talk about this in our last meeting, but it's really important to underscore the point that the bridge is really not an amenity or a convenience. It's a thoroughfare for moving science and product from one manufacturing facility to a connecting facility that does all the reagent studies and assay studies. So they're really symbiotic in nature in terms of the facility's requirements to have this connectivity. And that's really pretty much important a component with regards to the bridge utility. Again, as a recap, both facilities are dedicated to cell therapies. Most importantly, our type 1 diabetes therapy, which is a one-in-kind therapy, a single dose therapy that is time sensitive in its nature in terms of its deployment to the patient. I think I mentioned in our last meeting that we have a 72-hour latency from the final drug product to getting to the patient. So the importance of a quick and expeditious thoroughfare between manufacturing and the testing of the assay is really incredibly important to us getting to a full commercial capacity out of these two infrastructure assets that we have. And the other, I think, really important component is the product is environmentally and environmentally sensitive. It's also time sensitive. So not only do we have a 72-hour latency period from final dosing of the patient to getting that dose in the patient, which includes the logistics of sending that dose to a patient anywhere, both domestically and internationally, is they're very temperature and humidity sensitive. So the bridge allows us the opportunity to manage within the confounds of that 72-hour period from drug substance, drug product, to all of its testing and then getting it out to the patients in a much more efficient manner and a much more, frankly, safe manner for both the dose and the patient itself. So that's really the impetus of this ask of the committee, of the subcommittee in this case. And also just a reminder, we went through this in the last meeting, but we did test other options, both the movement of logistically of these materials across street infrastructure, as well as the tested deeply actually the opportunity for a tunnel, which just did not work given certain elevation changes, utilities in the streets, and a myriad of other design-based nuances that made that approach nearly impossible to facilitate. So that's just a recap of the impetus of the ask of the bridge.
Thanks, Chuck.
Well, thanks.
Thanks. And then just a quick reminder that, when we're looking at this area, it's deeply rich in history and textures and landscape and features. So this becomes a iconic gateway and a moment that is really important to the project. We're looking at the contemporary interpretation of that environment, not to copy it, but look at that contemporary interpretation of the industrial vernacular. Next, what was really important was our study and research that we did with a very successful bridges in Boston. Off on the left-hand side, you can see Liberty Mutual, top and bottom at different angles. You can look at the transparency, the lighting, and the elegance of that bridge design. On the right-hand side, we have samples of the Boston University Medical Center, upper right, and lower right is Boston Children's Hospital. All of these, look at transparency. It's just not into the bridge, but being able to get a sense of the mass and architecture that is beyond, which is very nice. The lighting, takes on another, kind of transcended feature, that really gives life to the public realm, which is fantastic. And what's happening with the, the features that are underneath the bridge as well. I'll look at these things later on, but some of these have structures that actually go, in the public realm, and they have that impact, such as the Boston University Medical Center. For bridge comparisons and the metrics, off on the left-hand side, we have the Liberty Mutual Bridge. You can see that cross-section of the street and the adjacent buildings themselves. It's a span of 83.5 feet, 22 feet clear. It has a camber structure for the floor, and then is a nice cabling structure that happens above. So you can see that. And in comparison to the Vertex Bridge, you can see the span there of nearly 100 feet with a clearance of almost 34 feet underneath that, with the nice shaping of the public realm down below. What you have there as you enter both buildings is a sea level rise. It explains the transition over here. The other thing that we measured, and it was really important to the design, is how the bridge itself touches both of these buildings themselves, and having enough canvas, quote unquote, for the bridge to have some of that space around it. Next, please. Here's just a plan comparison. The Liberty Mutual Bridge up above, you can see the length, 83 feet plus. Its width is 12 feet compared to the Vertex Bridge, which has a span of 100 feet and a width of 14.5. Those are some nice metrics of those two bridges. So a little bit about our thinking from a team design approach and opportunities. When looking at, these are the three opportunities that we were looking at. The outer ones that are gray were closer to intersections, and certainly the one on the right-hand side. As that moves closer to that intersection, we're a little bit concerned about the definition of the architectural massing and edges. So it competes a little bit with that. And as soon as we go to the preferred location, that really becomes secondary to the overall expression and experience in the urban environment, and certainly it respects both entryways. The other thing that's really important, as it moves to the midpoint, it has synergies with the programs of both buildings, which are great assets there, and also the preferred connection as it connects into the lower building, LC2. The way it hits the more solid portion of the building, you'll see it in a little bit more detail in a moment.
And Joe, about halfway through.
Okay. Running through here, cross sections right in here, looking at the different levels of LC1 and LC2. There's a lot of synergies that are happening with the third level there because of the research and having a wonderful clearance underneath the bridge. Again, if we looked at the fourth floor, we looked at that. There's a little bit of canvas above that commercial manufacturing floor right there, in how it connects to the building of LC1. Next one, please. Connection to LC1, just looking at where that is, respectful of structure, looking at the grid, the curtain wall. Go to the next one, please. Here, if this connection here, if it moves to the right, it's into the angled portion of the massing. Over to the left, it gets closer to the crossing, that intersection in the curtain wall. So we found a nice landing within the massing there. Next one, please. This is just to indicate how we are looking at the datum points. Once again, that vertex point with the structure coming down, that inflection point, how that gets resolved into the structure of the bridge and the underbelly of the bridge, and then transitioning that energy into the datum points on the left-hand side, LC1, and then you can see the same attempt to work that integration to the portal of LC2. Next, please. A little bit more detail here, really looking at the refined, you know, the transparency, look at the materiality, looking at how you connect into those existing skins. And next one, please. I will transition to hand off to Kless, who's going to go a little bit more into the design evolution. Thank you.
Klaus, you're on mute.
Hi, nice to see everyone. So you had asked about our process in the previous meeting. So we started with one of the very first exhibits that we made for this, which basically outlined 9 ideas for how we could sort of structure this bridge, what the partie of this bridge would be. These are sort of separated into 3 schemes, and being that there's similarities across the rows here. So just quickly, at the top row, we looked at different configurations of more traditional truss types, building supported, column supported, and like a Varendale truss. In the second row, we came up with this idea for the eccentric truss. We didn't come up with the idea, but we were taken with the idea of an eccentric truss to give some dynamic form to the bridge. So here you're seeing again one that's supported at the buildings, one supported with a column, and then another one supported with a vertical column, all having their own structural solutions to each of these ideas. And then finally at the bottom, we talked about the idea of a cable. I think this idea sort of came from that industrial vernacular of the seaport, these cranes that you see out there. So on the left, again, a sort of a column cable hybrid, in the center, a fully cabled structure. And then just for comparison's sake, we looked at a structure similar to what we saw at Liberty Mutual, which is obviously not what we want. We don't want to copy that bridge, but just for comparison's sake, we wanted to look at that as well. So from that, we sort of landed on 4 schemes. This is actually 2 variants of 2 schemes. So on the left, you're seeing what was the previous scheme B, and but with a column, as mentioned. The second scheme envisioned that same idea, that eccentric truss, but without a column. Still, in the early stages of understanding the structural implications of all these. And then the third and fourth schemes are sort of variants on this cable structure from above. Where we finally landed, it was actually an easy decision in the end, because we really wanted to minimize the impact on the public realm. And the only scheme that really did that was scheme 2. It was the simplest structurally, and it kept secondary elements sort of out of that secondary space. So from that, we assembled these sort of all the comments that we got from the stakeholders, and we sort of came up with sort of four tenets for the design of the bridge. The first one is, again, that the bridge should have no supports in the public right of way. Second one, that we would connect at the 3rd floor, because it was important that we had a large clear space underneath the bridge, both for the trucks and cars that are going through, especially the trucks, and also for the public realm that we worked so hard to establish in front of the new building and the old. We wanted to make the bridge seem light, and again, that was the idea of that simple eccentric truss, coupled with a lot of the other decisions that we made about material and other things. And then finally, we really, as Joe already mentioned, we wanted this to like blend in and integrate really well with those 2 buildings. Just to give you a quick run through of our process, obviously we started with the simple mass of the bridge. How big do we need this to be for our program? What are the basic parameters that we need to achieve in this bridge? Secondly, we took that idea of the truss and we sort of applied it to that form. We were really taken with the eccentric idea. We did a little more study. We came up with Maxell. We came up with a path forward on the structure. I think it was also important here that we pushed the underside up, and that was again another move to sort of really accentuate that truss form. On the third diagram, what you're seeing is just an understanding of how that form interfaces with both the two buildings that it touches, but also the public realm below. It's really important. Next, we looked at the envelope of the bridge itself, and it became clear. You know, it's always been clear that maximum transparency was paramount here. So the first thing we did is thinking about the structure a little further. We took the upper piece, the upper structural long members, and we actually moved it to the center. And what that enabled us to do was really create these views from the public realm up through the bridge, much more transparent than if we had those bigger structural members at the corners. And again, that was a lot of structural work to get that to happen. Then, of course, a very simple glass facade, which would envelop the three sides. It's important that the glass comes all the way to the bottom and doesn't, so we have no, let's say, non-glass area along the sides. And that's important in understanding a singular sort of look to the bridge itself, the reflectivity, the light transmission, all that. And then we studied the underside, which I'll get to a little bit more. We, as Joe talked about early, there was this narrative about the seaport that was very important to us. So we decided that, you know, sort of coupled with the desire to add a frit to the bridge, both for bird protection and reduction of solar heat gain, we could add this vernacular pattern to both the glass and the underside that would sort of impart this narrative to the bridge. And of course, the function of the bridge is very important. So we've been working hard to make sure that, you know, everything works. This is a very robustly designed and detailed structure that will last for a long time for
And
Vertex.
Klaus, you're at just about time. I know you all have a lot of content to go through, so I'd ask you to really try to speed it up. And
all right, I'm going to go quick. This is a diagram of the underside of the bridge. I know you had a lot of questions about this. Basically, a straight panel at the center, which connects these two very conspicuous datum points on the bridge. And then we pushed up, as I explained in the last diagram, I pushed up those vertex points, and it created this dynamic form. And with these sort of triangular panels that you're seeing here. And you're also starting to see the vernacular pattern on the bottom here. And here are a couple more views of that. I'm going to go quick, sorry. Okay. We've been looking very carefully at lighting here, very subtle lighting. I know there were questions about like where and how we're lighting the bridge in the last meeting. We made very deliberate decisions about this because we didn't want the bridge or the underside to be overpowering. So we were envisioning subtle lighting along the glass facade at the sort of the seam between the clear glass and the spandrel condition, and then all the other lighting within the bridge and below, let's say, shin level, so that no exposed luminaries are seen from the public realm. Here's another view of that. Finally, materials, light and bright. We went with things that were very, very neutral, but also very lasting, like stainless steel for the underside. Obviously, our glass is triple paned, highly energy efficient, and low E for maximum clarity. Like here's a diagram of the frit pattern, which I can get into more if you have questions. Some components of the bridge. You had asked about models. We have them. I have them in my hand, which I can show everyone. These were just a part of the studies that we did for this project. And finally, some views. Hope I'm not too far over the limit. Thank you very much.
thank you, team. Commissioners.
Maybe I'll start as the other commissioners think about their comments. You know, thanks for the presentation. It feels very similar to what you showed us the last time without including options that I think we discussed at the monthly meeting. But my general thoughts about the bridge is that seeing that model was really helpful. And maybe if you could just go back to the image of the model. I think you mentioned, earlier in your inspiration page, the industrial vernacular. And somehow I feel that the model is more expressive of that industrial vernacular than the actual renderings. And I don't know if it's the material choices for the structure, the stainless steel being, you know, so light and contrasting from the buildings that you're actually tying into, that I wonder if that is something that you looked at in terms of a different, reading of that. I am starting to wonder if this, analogy to the, um, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the name of the bridge, the insurance company.
Liberty Mutual.
Yes, Liberty Mutual is really the right, is really the right reference for this bridge at this location. And it's just it's honestly what I'm thinking of in regards to what I'm seeing, because it is very different. It's definitely much longer. It's not as light. It's the glass has to be different for, qualities that you guys have explained. And I wonder if that would be a departure or something you studied. Maybe I'll just ask the question just to get a conversation going.
Yeah, I mean, I think we we looked at the Liberty Mutual Bridge as a reference, but um, not as an influence, I would say.
Mhm.
There are qualities to that bridge which are incredible, you know, the transparency, the exposed structure, all that. But we very deliberately uh, went in a different direction. We wanted this to be obviously different, but also of the seaport. You know, this is a building, a bridge um, in the seaport, and it's important that it reflects that location.
I mean, I
There,
agree. And
yeah,
I think the asymmetry of the structure is interesting. And I think it actually is appropriate for that industrial vernacular. It feels um, like a crane or something. And so I think the qualities are there. I just feel like they're being hidden by the glass, and the expression isn't as robust as perhaps it could be. And I don't know if it's a material choice or so I'll leave it at that. I think the underside too, it would be nice to see other options that you studied. I guess I'm not seeing iterations, and this is a big, commitment to approve a bridge, a pedestrian bridge for all of the qualities that make sense in terms of, transportation and your tight timelines. We get that, but in the end, we really need to focus on the design. And I feel like we're not seeing iterations. We're just seeing a similar proposal to what we saw at the monthly meeting.
thank you, and we will certainly study that. I will say though, we have hundreds of slides we could share on the process because it's robust.
Yeah. And I think that's what we
Right.
kind of expect at subcommittee is a conversation rather than a presentation of like, what are the things that you studied? Did you, like for instance, the position of the bridge, you're leading us to trust that this location is the right one, but you're not sharing perspectives that show it closer to Tide Street. I definitely agree that the angled, orientation to both buildings doesn't make sense, but we're not seeing, the things that you have studied behind the curtain. And I think that's what I'm just asking. Can we see iterations of that?
But perhaps, Klaus, maybe you can show those iterations a little, because we have got multiple studies and slides on that to help Mimi understand the perspectives that we took on those different connection points, both north, south, and where we landed on. Maybe that would help kind of inform the discussion and the questions that might be remaining.
Yeah, I mean, we would be more than happy to do that.
just to
Maybe I
add
should
to,
also, and for everyone else, I should mention that I have the 3D model open. If there's anything you haven't seen or a perspective you haven't seen, you'd like to see.
just to add to what Mimi is asking is, I'm curious as to what the differences are between the iteration that we're seeing today and what we saw 2 weeks ago. It's hard to distinguish the differences. But I will say that I think one of the most interesting aspects is the structural configuration of this by necessity. And it does feel hidden behind the sleekness of the glass. And I understand that the buildings themselves are fairly sleek, but I wonder if there isn't an opportunity to kind of, as you
might-
say, relate it to the area, to the seaport.
Laura, I wonder, and Mimi, I wonder if, looking at this diagram that we did, with the envelope on the left-hand side, if we took a approach where that sheathing, the underside actually turned that outer corner and became, part of that expression of where the actual steel is, and reduce in a sense the amount of glazing at that point. Because I think that one of the things I'm sensing is what was attractive about that model is the opacity, So what you take all the skin off of that, and what's really nice about that model is where you see the structure is very robust on top, how we moved it to the center spine, and you see the floor line in that steel there, and perhaps it just simply, not simply, but it's an approach to how to look at this, coming back to you and just saying, hey, we look at the wrapper slightly different here to reinforce, sort of the structural moves that really ties into the industrial nature of what we see, in the neighborhood.
One of the things I truly like about the model, and I think, Mimi, correct me, I think you're going there too, is this tension of sort of the bigger pieces with what is this actually the structural, the true working part of this, what is really holding up and allows you to make that 100-foot span. And once it's sheathed, it's really that tension, that kind of interest is erased.
Right. And that's exactly right, Laura. And even by selecting the materials, the stainless steel color even makes it go away further. And your building that you're tying into is fairly expressive. It has that, anodized, dark anodized aluminum cladding that is expressive. You see channels on the building, and you could probably go back to the imagery. And so the buildings are expressive, but somehow the sleekness of this bridge doesn't seem to be relating to the buildings that it's tying into.
Yeah, I do wonder if some of that is just the medium, and like certainly, you're not going to build that wrapper on the physical model, but then when everything's in kind of this render world, I think it does kind of have you do lose some of that texture a bit. So I'm also trying to maybe divorce my comments from what this particular medium of like the rendering is kind of giving us here. Like, that's nice to see. Sorry, I'm just watching this spin here. Yeah, I think this is certainly helpful to sort of see here. And yeah, even this landscape view, I think it's interesting. You can sort of see the structure perhaps more than you do with some of the output that we see in the PDF and the presentation. But yeah, I think I appreciated the rigor and what's actually needed to be done to make this bridge possible, and sort of some of the diagrams here were pretty compelling. I would agree with Mimi though that it does seem, in terms of the newness of what you're presenting, you're kind of showing us how you got to this conclusion, which I sort of agree with amongst the four schemes you presented. But how do we build off of this and engage again the location question a little bit, further maybe questioning more so than refinement. I guess is kind of what I would maybe agree with Mimi on, but I think yeah, I mean, this is I appreciate seeing the structure. And I think I guess I probably advocate for celebrating that a little bit more in terms of not obviously it's enclosed, but not sort of hiding it as much, if that makes sense. I am curious, and I realize we're in a context that's not all the way built out, but what this would look like in more of a kind of photo real or literally like photo render where you kind of dump this into a photograph, just to sort of, again, for me, sometimes seeing everything as a rendering, it's hard to sort of get a better understanding of the existing textures of the place. But just particularly for some of those, like for some of those long views, yeah, I think it's again, maybe I'm just sort of stuck in the rendering a little bit too much, but
So,
again,
yeah, Jonathan, I can understand your point here. Obviously we rely heavily on the renderings because we got some existing buildings that are there and
some
you
that
know,
aren't. Yeah.
some that are not. So that plays into it a little bit. I do want to say that, you know, when we go look at the night shots and we have the lighting, we wanted to have something that allowed us, there is that opacity, you know, behind the glass that sort of mimics where the structure is, but at the same time, in a very elegant, maybe in a sophisticated way, that lighting sort of has that gradation of that element that helps to redefine that structural component. But it's a layered element, which we found quite attractive in looking at optionalities along the way here. So then this was key. You know, why did we move that glass beyond and pull it out in front? It's just to pull that down and then and you have the solid nature underneath and it's kind of sliding underneath that glass. So the interplay of those two things we thought was a little bit of the magic of not being so didactic and straightforward and heavy-handed, but yet, you know, do that modern interpretation of the industrial piece, which out being like this is a crane, right? And this is solid. We wanted to do that interpretation. So that's the art form. That's sort of the beauty of what we're trying to achieve in doing that.
Got it.
Okay.
I will say, Joe, that I think that's a really successful detail where the glass does go down to the perimeter. And I think that, you know, as well, we could talk about the lighting effect. But I do think, you know, I would just, I'm curious if the structural elements that, you know, beam that is supporting the roof and the, you know, the angle bracing is a darker tone would allow the bridge to even feel more transparent than it is. But I don't think you want to do that at the base where the glass sides down. So I don't know. It's hard. It's hard to know without seeing iterations, but
So I can speak to that. I can speak to that one point. It's very important. We have some studies. I don't know, Kless, if you can look at that. We looked at color changes and we did it in a way where we have the light version in here, but we gradate it to a very dark solution. And the reason for doing that, and we can share that with you, is in something that, you know, Bill brought on, you know, and sort of asked and challenged the team here, what of this bridge makes it, you know, have a dialogue with the two buildings. And one of them was the color. So we actually looked at a charcoal color and a lighter gray. It's almost like saying we don't want to take, you know, the applique or the typology of the skin and apply it. We're certainly not going to do that on the bridge. But we thought what we could do is take the coloration, which is sort of darker. On the left-hand side, we have the darker charcoal fins of LC1. And on the right-hand side, we have the darker panels that if we then had a darker paint, you know, hue on the structure itself, it might lend itself. So that's how it really connects. It's by the color and the texture from within the bridge itself. Again, it's a subtlety, but it might be a sophisticated way of saying this is how it relates to building the building.
I think just a slight comment here is I think maybe you've really highlighted the sort of the contradictions that we've been grappling with on this project. You know, there's this will for the bridge to be very light and unimposing, but also there's this vernacular which you can't step away from in the seaport, which sort of leads you in a very separate direction. And I think we've been trying to, you know, thread that needle very carefully between the two. You know, I think Joe makes a really great point. I think there are benefits to darkening the structure so that it becomes more apparent from the outside. I would say personally, the result on the inside is less than successful, because it sort of creates some heaviness within that space where, you know, as a user of it, you know, and I think as architects, we know this very well. There's this idea of compression before you get into this very sort of unique space. And that's something that, you know, we're trying to balance.
Bill's had his hand up for a while. Go ahead, Bill.
Okay, let me, I appreciate the work that we're seeing going on here, and I thank you all for that. In your opening statement, or shortly after, you talked about the reasons why you like Scheme 2, and I would agree with you. It was because it was simplest, and that it removed secondary elements. And by the way, it also was how to blend best into the two buildings, but I'll come back to that. So on the simplicity, and I realize there is an interest here in responding to the industrial past of the district, but you know, there's not, or at least from my point of view, there's not much in your two buildings which refer to that past. And so I would urge you, we all be a little careful that we don't suddenly impose a kind of historicist iron structure or something to a pair of buildings which don't have that vocabulary. And I would also, the simplicity is something that I think one has to be careful. If the bridge gets too complex, even with small minor elements, does it become kind of a cartoon? And so if you're going to do the elegant frick patterns, which looks interesting to me, I would try to get rid of some of the other unsimple matters. And so for me, the most unsimple matter is the asymmetry of the bridge as it sits there in this view. At the left-hand side, is the base is a very different base than on the right-hand side. Different dimensions. And I'm not sure for what purpose. It seems way overcomplicated to me. So that's an initial reaction that I have. Then the question of how to blend into the two buildings, I think, is a potential opportunity. But this bridge doesn't look like it's blending. You know, the blending on the left is very different from the blending on the right, again, because of those dimensions. And there's this third issue. Now you're straightening it out, but there is a third issue, and that is the walking surface on the, I guess it's on the left, is a foot higher than on the right. I mean, vice versa. The walking surface on the left is a foot higher. On the right is a foot higher than on the left. And so that is also something that adds to a perhaps unnecessary complexity. So even on that question, I wonder why you couldn't get the bridge to be either, well, the building's an existing building, right?
Yes.
The two buildings they're existing right now. They're real.
No.
Or are they not?
No, one building's there, Lighting Center 1. So in this view, the building behind us is existing. As you're looking into, you know, this image, Lighting Center 2 is being built now. It's not.
I see. Okay, so there are ways that you can make the walking surface of the bridge parallel to the ground plane. And I think when the bridge gets out of kilter, even by 1 foot, that is something that one might try to avoid. Now, I don't know whether which building is existing and which is not. And I mean, do you have the opportunity to ramp up the lower side of the bridge, or is the lower side already the existing one? I don't know. Can you go back to the previous slide?
Yeah. The only comment I would make just initially, Bill, is that the walking surface inside the bridge slopes independent of really anything else on the bridge. So there are conspicuous points. For instance, the bottom of the window in the top of the spandrel is a plumb horizontal line, or the horizontal line. This line here, and then the undersides actually
Which line?
meet.
That's the horizontal parallel to the ground plane?
Correct.
Okay. How about the base of it also?
So the base is because we were trying to meet, you know, these sort of datum points on the bridge. You know, the bridge. The sun is not good for this view. These lines, we've you know, sort of created the shape of the underside based on meeting these points on the 2 buildings.
And that seems to me adding a complexity or a requirement that might not be necessary. I mean, because the asymmetry and the aggressive asymmetry, I think, makes the bridge seem like something else, and yet it's meeting the buildings in seemingly identical way. I mean, moderately identical ways. There's nothing about the connection of the bridge to either of those 2 buildings that is at all special. And so that I'm finding in each of these that I'm sharing with you a celebration of complexity that I don't think is helping you with the aesthetic of the bridge personally. And it takes away from some of your structural ambitions. Right now I'm looking at that, and I'm looking at the base of the bridge is 1 set of lines, and these diagonal lines is a totally different set of lines. And I'm urging a greater simplicity now. That may seem like a greater modernism and not very with tying into the industrial fabric of the district, but if one's going to go with an industrial fabric there's usually a symmetry or consistency to that. So I'm just pleading with you to make the thing more simple, and then to share with us how it does respond to the 2 buildings, which right now it still feels like it's simply placed in between them. And I admit this is, you know, tricky, but it's such a limited design problem that I have to believe by focusing on you can solve it. And so I may come back with more comments, but you may want to comment about what I've said.
Sure. I think, Bill, one thing I might suggest, and when we come back to do a presentation, I'll show you a little bit more context of where these 2 buildings themselves and how they relate to the industrial park. I mean, in the background is, you know, the innovative design building, you know, where the grid is really king. You know, it's relentless in its rhythm that goes across that building, and it's quite beautiful in many ways, but it's broken up only with solid portions every so often, so you get the definition of 6 buildings, or I should say 5 buildings that are connected at that point. Here, and these 2 buildings, and we'll demonstrate it later, we looked at that grid and we looked at how on the right-hand side we can create and play with that grid to create something a little bit more interesting from an overall massing, but at the same time relate to the lab module. And on the left-hand side, the same way, we looked at the grid and playful grid as it moves across that facade. And then as it looks at the precast panels, which is the rest of the expression of the building. I know it's not on this side, but there are a lot of thinking that went into those buildings that were the genesis of this neighborhood.
Give me a couple examples of that.
Well, it's right in here, the solid portion, when I say the more solid portion, we looked at the grid, and then we looked at the 2-story, 1-story expression that goes across ISQ 3, which is on the left-hand side, or Light and Center 2. And that was a playful nature, and it came out of the studies of the building on the left-hand side, which is the IDB.
You said left-hand side twice, describing different buildings. Can you put a pointer on what you're referencing?
Yeah, class, if you're looking at the skin of Light and Center 2.
Which is which building?
It has a pointer right there.
On the left,
On
Bill.
the left.
On
Okay,
the left. On the left, and it's on the left side where the bridge is actually connecting. That started out as a grid, very similar to the ID building, which is in the background here. And we played with that many different ways to eventually get something that is a grid, but it's something very different from what you would see historically in that area.
Bill, can I ask a question? Because
go ahead.
I understand that you are, asking for simplicity, but are you in support of the asymmetry of all of the, diagrams they suggested for the structure? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Okay, I would say that simplicity implies perhaps a single asymmetry, but if it starts having 2 or 3 asymmetries, it gets very confusing. And as I look at the base of the bridge, that's one asymmetry. As I look at the structural element, whatever that is, are those what are they? Steel rods or something? That's a very different asymmetry. And I don't see those 2 asymmetries leading to a greater connection of the building on the left to the building on the right, or vice versa. And I'm just not seeing it.
Yeah.
I see it as a drawing, but I don't see it as an experience of coming through under the bridge, and you're going to deal the asymmetry of the frit, which is yet a third. And I think it's honestly confusing and drawing attention to itself, when in many ways the purpose of these bridges is to not be too attention-getting, or if so, if they are attention-getting, then let's make it really dramatic.
So can the team let us know if the depth of the asymmetry that's happening on the shorter side of the span than the longer side, is that by necessity or is that a choice? Can you control that? Right. So in this image, the depth that I'm questioning is on the right-hand side, connecting to, I think, LC1. Like,
Yeah.
is that needed or is that a choice?
We have a slide for this. Yeah, this one. There was a deliberate choice to create a geometry that sort of stitched together the two sides. We felt that was a way to sort of reinforce that central vertex point. And it created this pattern of triangular panels that seemed very dynamic to the form of the building. There is function in the space that it creates, because it's basically the space where you know, some utility connections can be made, but also to the point that Bill made earlier about the walking surface, which is actually not, like I said, directly tied to any of the elements you're seeing on the outside, but it does sort of tuck itself into that space. So yes, there is a necessity. I guess the big arrow you're seeing here is maybe the only piece on the bridge which sort of mimics the walking surface inside.
Is the cross section at the underside of the bridge where we're looking at it now? I'm sorry, it's not very dark here, but is it like that and then it flattens out at these ends? In other words, is that the sectional condition there?
Yeah, let me show you the
Oh, thank you.
So it becomes a triangle in the middle and flattens out at both ends.
correct.
So of course, that's another asymmetry.
Yeah, that's why I was
third one.
pointing that out, is it's number 4.
Number 4, it is number 4. I just think, I'll be honest, I think you're getting too many ideas into a single bridge. And I'd choose the one idea that had the most to do with your ambition for the bridge, but not all 4 of them. Sorry to say it.
If we go back
Yeah.
to the, I'm sorry, go ahead, respond.
No, I mean, I think the I'm going to come back to this sort of idea of contradictions a little bit. I think, you know, for us, we thought it was really important that that fourth elevation, that fourth face of the building that faced the public realm, had some interest. You know, if you look back at some of the precedents that we showed earlier, specifically the Children's Bridge or the BU Hospital Bridge, the undersides are really flat. I mean, they're not unattractive, but they don't engage that space. You know, it's sort of like, it feels a little bit like, you know, an enclosure rather than a moment of sort of engagement with that very public space that we're creating. So I mean, I think there's a little bit of you know, sort of imparting a bigger design idea on the functional need of that fourth face of the bridge.
And maybe in that vein, if I could ask the commissioners a pointed question, I think one of the challenges that the city had in working, you know, with the proponent on the design concept here was exactly what Klaus was just referencing. How do we, you know, maintain this lightness overall, and recognize, you know, that the surface creating a ceiling to the public realm was something that we really wanted to create, you know, interest in, so that as someone approached the bridge, but especially as someone was under the bridge, right, they experienced a dynamic ceiling in some way. And I certainly take to heart, Bill, you know, and the rest of the team, you're expressing that the balance of the different elements here seems maybe not in harmony yet. But I guess I'm asking, you know, for suggestions on direction of how to achieve that harmony while still trying to, you know, create this level of visual interest right to the underside of the bridge. You know, how do we keep it simple but dynamic at the same time?
I guess I would ask from the standpoint of the context, the urban context here, whether or not that fleeting moment under the bridge is really worth it. Because it's introduced a lot of complexity. And then I'm going to say something that only a landscape architect could say, because the rest of the architects on this call just may think that I'm being insane. But there's this lightness of the bridge itself. And I wonder whether or not the underside of the bridge would be better served if it were dark like the buildings, so that the lightness, the comparison of the lightness between the top and the bottom, which is in shadow most of the time, whether or not that would help to kind of take away one of the conflicts and have a way to kind of connect to the darkness of both buildings.
I think, Laura, for me, that, I mean, we heard that comment earlier on and you're reinforcing that piece. And what I walk away, among other things, is for us to look at this and look at the materiality, the choices, but what we have, what you're seeing now, that we should come back to you with a few options of that, where here there was intentional, is light, is stainless steel, is reflective. But, the other option here is to look at a darker surface in here and see how that measures as a comparison to that, because you're going to get a different feel. It could be that lighter sheathing component with it upturned and expressed that way could have a different kind of simplicity, perhaps, that we're all looking for, but yet that dynamic nature of what we want. We want to keep it simple, but dynamic.
I will say that we have tested a couple different stainless steel options, and there is one that is sort of a I can't remember the technical term, but it's a dark tinted stainless steel, and it's quite beautiful. And I think, again, I feel like I'm beating a drum here, but like the contradictions here are, is like we love that material as an idea, but I do worry that any addition of a dark material creates a heaviness to the overall
For
bridge.
me, it's the underside. It isn't about the box that's on top of it. I get why that is, why you've chosen the lightness of it. It's that this kind of is the shininess, and I know it's not truly shiny, but the shininess of that for me kind of almost emphasizes the planes that are you said necessary for the structure and utility, housing, etc. And then, this really shows my ignorance, but is there a way to invert that so that, I don't know why all my drawings are showing up, but is there a way to invert that so that it doesn't hang down and thicken that elevation that Bill was talking about, all the various
the facets that make it three-dimensional might not be necessary. I mean, I think these are the explorations that I think we're curious about. And, without seeing them, it's hard to know if this is it. And so I think that is what we're asking you to look at options, look at material choices, look at simplifying, and really focusing on the asymmetry of the structure itself, I think, is what I would say that we want to see the next time we meet.
And I wonder if other commissioners have, very specific asks for which types of studies and or materials or alternatives that they'd like the proponent to study.
Well, I'd like to ask one thing that came up a few minutes ago, and that is, I know you and I hear you as designers, we believe this is your intention, that I guess it's the building on the right has a set of heavier window openings to reflect the industrial area, but of course the one on the left does not. And so by making the bridge more industrial, so it's one like the one on the right, is going to be kind of out of keeping with the one on the left. And so I would like to simply ask, are there other ways to connect these two somewhat disparate buildings with the bridge? That is another challenge of this. For instance, I'm wondering, why wouldn't the vocabulary of the bridge going into each of the two buildings be more interesting than like it's right now attached to the edge of two different buildings? Or arguably, I guess you could say, why couldn't each building reach out to the bridge and kind of represent itself as it grabs a hold of the bridge? But just sitting on the edge of the building, and that started with your first rendering, and it sticks with me that it's a connecting two somewhat different building forms in that.
So, Bill, are you thinking about a more expressive joint between the two buildings, and that the joint might be different?
Well, that's certainly the implication of what I was saying. I'm trying to respond to Laura's correct observations, and what I'm hearing her saying about the fact that this bridge should be connecting these two buildings, if I heard her correctly. And I'm seeing this bridge looks like it's been plopped down and bolted to each building, rather than engaging each building. Now, I know you have one building already done, so how you engage it is beyond me. And you have another that has working drawings that are operative. And so what I've just said may not be feasible, but just finding what I've said before. So.
I guess I appreciate the question, Seth, as well, about how can we provide more maybe sort of clearer things to test. And I guess I certainly acknowledge that we've collectively said make it simple and dynamic, make it light and heavier. So I perhaps acknowledge that this is a tricky thing to kind of wrap our heads around. Maybe the only thing I'll just offer is I definitely appreciate the intent around a ceiling, and again, this is where things can be somewhat subjective. I mean, I think some of the inspiration, I think there's things that can certainly be tested to Bill's point and be simplified and cleaned a little bit, because I think there might be too many layers of the things going on. But I think the ambition of doing something there, I don't want to dilute that too much. And I think if we make it so simple, then why are we doing it? So I think this is an opportunity to do something. So again, hopefully that's not that's not a very specific thing to test, but I do think some of the conversation around again, making this thing tighter, cleaner, I'm all for it, but I also want to not lose the dynamism that is so inherent in what you're trying to do here.
Okay, we're just over an hour into this conversation. If commissioners are amenable, I'd like to open up for public comment, and then we can talk about any further next steps besides what's already been shared. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, at this time, we'd like to invite any members of the public in attendance who may wish to contribute public testimony to raise your digital hand, and I will call on you. If you're calling in by phone, dial *69 on your dial pad to activate the raise hand function, and dial *6 to unmute yourself. Please state your name and any relevant project affiliation information, and please keep comment to 2 minutes. And at this time, I'm not seeing any raised hands. So I will close the public testimony portion of this project and turn it back to the commissioners for any final comments or suggestions to help direct the team as they work on some studies and alternatives for additional review at a upcoming design subcommittee.
I mean, I'll just offer that I think, you know, what I'm hearing is support of the asymmetrical structural expression. I'm hearing that we need to study material options, whether it be on the underside, the color of the structure, et cetera, simplifying the frit so it works with the geometry imposed by the asymmetrical structure, and looking at underside options to be both simpler and not too stripped of a design intention. So, I mean, I think Jonathan is absolutely right. We might have given you, you know, opposite ends of the spectrum, but I think if you focus on you know, those elements I just noted, material, underside, and Laura.
Sorry, connection to the building.
Yes, connections to the building.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. And the frit pattern.
Yeah. I think those are all excellent points, and thanks, Mimi, for sort of summarizing all of that for us. That's really good.
Yeah,
Appreciate
and I
it.
think the next time you come, assuming that, you know, we have a similar group, that it's really not all of the preamble stuff about the structural logics and stuff. Like, let's just, I recommend just getting into options,
Sure.
because I think we're in support of the diagrams that you shared and
Good.
where you're launching off for the structural diagram.
Appreciate that
Can-
too. Okay.
Can I add a request that goes back to Mimi's point number one? The endorsement of the asymmetry. I, for one, I'm not sure I can remember pedestrian bridges that I've seen that I thought were splendid, that were aggressively asymmetrical. But could you bring 4 or 5 photographs of pedestrian bridges elsewhere in the country or the world that are asymmetrical? So that we get the sense of, you know, how that asymmetry plays in an arguably very symmetrical setting.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you to commissioners for that specific direction. And, you know, I can certainly take some of the heat as we advise the proponent to bring back the original diagram, the rationale for the bridge, just to make sure that we all had sort of buy-in on that front. Sounds like there is, and to Bill's point, we want to explore the, I think, concept of asymmetry, how to make it elegant, and make sure it's the right fit for this site, and how it can work overall, as well as then the specific points that Mimi requested being studied, as well as the earlier, I think, requests to make sure that this is the right location in the building. And I want to thank the proponent also for bringing their Enscape model and getting it developed to such a degree that it really was a useful tool to fly around in this, and was actually more descriptive in some ways than some of the still images. Most of the time, models are not developed to a level where they are sort of a big help in the conversation, but I think this one definitely was. So thank you for investing the time and energy in all of that. And I think, you know, one thing we didn't touch on was lighting, but Mimi, you referred to it at one point. I just want to make sure we get all the comments out on the table. Was there a concern you had with the lighting specifically?
Me, not necessarily,
Okay.
but I do think in the exploration of the underside of the, structure is lighting a component. I think it's probably worth studying, but I'll leave it up to the team to see what that, feels right to them in terms of options.
Could I ask a question that isn't directive? It's just to raise a question. And Mimi and Mimi's firm is, arguably the most interesting urban design firm in the city. Would one? I've kind of wondered whether the alternative bridge location you showed us that was farther from the street corner made it a more welcoming street coming from the dry dock. That that bridge shouldn't be some blockage to people coming from the water side through this complex. And I'm not suggesting that we even investigate that, and your plans may not even allow for that. But we passed through that part of the conversation quite quickly, and so the urban design question of, are bridges better off far from the entry corner, or are they better closer? And I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, well, something I think we can get into. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, proponent team. We will move on now to the next project.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so 83, let me share my screen. A proposed project at 83 Leo Birmingham Parkway in Brighton is seeking Article 80B, large project entitlement, contemplates the demolition of an existing structure and surface parking lot and the development of approximately 220,000 square feet of residential use, about 338 units, and 175 off-street parking spaces in a single building on an approximately 2-acre site. This will be the first presentation of the proposed project to the BCDC Design Subcommittee following its introduction at the monthly meeting on October 8th, 2024. It is my understanding that there are no commissioners present who intend to recuse themselves. A reminder to proponent teams that presentations will be limited to 15 minutes. I will give presenters a halftime and 1-minute warning. And with that, I invite the proponent team to present as I work to elevate Tamara and Ian. Just give me 1 sec. Okay, you should both be elevated now and able to share your screens.
Do you mind also allowing Todd Fremont-Smith, our client, to be able to speak, perhaps to answer questions later?
Of course.
Please. Okay, great. Hello, everyone. I'm going to try to keep it upbeat before the Thanksgiving holiday here. Appreciate your time.
Are you afraid of having to cook?
I have to do a lot of cooking tomorrow, Bill. Yes.
Okay.
Let's see, here we go. Okay. Can you see my screen?
It's coming up. There we go.
Okay. All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for seeing us tonight. We are looking at this site, which is a very unique site. And I'm looking at the list of commissioners who were at the introductory meeting, and I find actually only Mimi Love of the group that we have here saw it before. So it's good that we actually included much of the original presentation. So I'll give you a quick overview and focus on what we heard. So it's a very interesting site at the edge of Brighton. As you can see here, it's existing condition on the edge of Leo Birmingham, where it's a lot of asphalt. We have an upper parking lot and a lower parking lot. Again, a lot of asphalt with a small TV station that's defunct in the middle. And then this great urban wild, we're calling it, which is existing. We'll talk about that in a minute. The sort of new emerging neighborhood at the level of Soldiers Field Place, which is 24 feet lower than the upper part of our site. And then again, Soldiers Field Road and the Charles River beyond. And as Seth mentioned, 338 units, of which 57 are affordable. It's like almost a 0.5 ratio of parking and a very high percentage of open space. So I'm gonna go to the next one. Go. Okay, so what we heard early October was we almost got approved in the intro meeting, but at the time the group was all architects. And so one of the big comments was, please present to the landscape architects from BCDC. So from the architects about the architecture, we just heard generally they really liked the approach to the materials, the form making, all of that, but we could celebrate both entrances more. And then improve what is seen on axis from a pedestrian passage down below, which we'll go into in a minute. But for landscape, they also mentioned this boundary to the amenity courtyard up on Leo Birmingham Parkway, just give them more information about that. Add green space to the cul-de-sac down below and investigate connection possibilities from the top to the bottom. So the site, just to give you some context, is really, really interesting. We sort of color coded this, as you can see. It's part of, historically, the sides of the river that flowed through here, sort of through Cambridge, Boston, and then the traditional neighborhoods kind of developed to the sides. It's very well connected to transit, bike paths, walking paths, with a 10-minute walk across the intersection. If you don't die when you try to cross that right now, because it's a huge expanse of parking and it feels very dangerous, but that will change. And you can walk or bike over to get to Boston Landing, the T, and downtown. But you can also take buses to Harvard Square. It's really a fantastic site on the edge of this neighborhood. There's also a park, which is being improved by Copley Wolf. And with me is Ian Ramey from Copley Wolf, who is our landscape architect. So he also knows a lot about the improvements happening to that DCR park. Okay, so just a timeline. Really, it used to be a completely pastoral site, and then we began the man versus nature battle, which we are still in. And it was then an abattoir, which is I always forget this name, a place where you butcher, a butcher house, slaughterhouse. Yes, very stinky. And then it got cleaned up as part of the City Beautiful movement by the Olmsted brothers, the sons of Olmsted, and turned into this wonderful racetrack and place where people would bike. Then after that, in the 50s, it was kind of mostly developed and surrounded by parking and vehicular movement. And now DCR is actually doing a road diet, and they're shrinking it to just one roadway with one way in each direction, plus a lot of green space, which is right in the front of our site, with a multi-use trail. So that's really fantastic. These are some existing photos. So if you're on the upper level, as we said, just lots and lots of parking, but this whole side is pretty much going away and being incorporated into our site. The street is actually kind of ending up centered because of the way it needs to connect to the intersection. But it is going to be sort of here with more green on either side. Soldiers Field Place is very much of a vehicular experience with some existing trees down there at the edge of our site and lots of new projects down here. Again, the entrance to which is not so nice right now, to the park, and then that Market Street intersection where you can walk across and get to the T. So our It's really interesting designing this, trying to really keep the trees, and that pushed our parking onto a couple of levels, but being able to snug them into the site slope with an entrance on the upper side only. And then developing these wings that go over the building of the parking. And this wing turned so that we can save all of these trees. And south, this is a south-facing courtyard for our residents, so pretty amazing orientation, again, opening that up. And then the greenery that we are now having added to the front of our site based on the multi-use trail. And then our architecture, which is sort of, we call it anti-box architecture, where we've added some nooks to the backs of the units for work from home. And we've developed a whole series of interesting unit types that create these kind of angled sides to the building. This is the existing site, looking at it sort of from the top level and that drop of 24 feet on the site slope. Just some materials here. We're really reducing it down to a very few amount of materials in our palette, which is this wood, tone, and charcoal panels, and then some graduated pavers at the entrance. And Ian will go into the landscape a little bit later. Real quick, where our amenity spaces lie. So we have the upper entrance with the upper amenity spaces opening into the residential amenity courtyard, and then units. We also have a bike entrance and bike storage on the upper level because we're doing a lot of improvements for the community in terms of just a great bike friendly space in front of the building. And then when we go to the lower level, we again have another secondary entrance with bikes and a dog lounge and a doggy outside area. We've got our loading, our transformers, and all the things that we need to kind of service this building at this end. And then some ground floor terraces that open out of these units looking toward the cul-de-sac. And another bike area in the garage. So lots of different bike areas, depending on how often you might use your bike.
And Tamara, about halftime.
Okay, thank you. Good, we're about halfway done. A little amenity space also on the roof with a little roof terrace that looks at the Charles River and downtown. And here the section, again, upper, lower, parking, nestled in between, and then the 6 stories of units above. I'm gonna hand it to Ian.
Great, thanks, Tamara. Hi, everybody. Just at a high level, talking about our landscape approach. Obviously, it's a very dynamic site. We have this incredible asset of the mature woodland on a very steep slope. And so the big idea with the landscape really is to kind of lean into that idea of prioritizing the natural features of the site and using that to guide the overall design, like the placement of the building, where the open spaces are, and to really take the idea, that naturalistic landscape approach that's present in the Grove, and extend that around the entire perimeter of the site. At a high level, the site today is like 71% impervious surface, mostly a parking lot. Our site plan is going to kind of reverse that balance, make the site about 65% permeable surface. We're saving about 80 trees, adding 100 new native trees, and then the open space on site that we're providing is 2.7 times greater than what's required by zoning. Next slide. So if we take a look at our public realm plan and sort of site improvements, we recognize that this faces 2 neighborhoods, right? It faces the Boston Landing and all the stuff that's happening as you go downtown, and then this newly emerging Soldiers Field Place. So we have 2 entry points into the building. The primary, or the front door, as we view it, is the one that faces the Parkway. We have this new linear park that's going to be developed, which is really great. So we're proposing that at the high side along Leo Birmingham Parkway, that we have this really active public realm. That's where the front door is. That's where we have our public amenities. There's a plaza there that engages with the proposed multi-use path. We're looking at public amenities in the form of bike parking, bike fix-it stations, drinking fountains, lots of public seating, that sort of thing. We're also proposing a small drop-off area for rideshare outside the front door. And we are retaining 1 curb cut to gain vehicular access into the garage to the left side of the plan. On the cul-de-sac side of the project, that's Soldiers Field Place, we have a secondary smaller entry with a little plaza there. Everything down there is kind of scaled down to be in scale with the smaller kind of cul-de-sac neighborhood. You heard Tamara mention that there's an outdoor dog area there. There's some walkout patios, and we are preserving trees along the street there. Next slide. So this is a blow up of that Parkway Plaza, as we call it, on the Leo Birmingham side of things. This is what we presented last, where you see the number 1, that's sort of the plaza entry into the building. 2 are the public bike facilities that we're proposing. Number 5 is where the blue bikes happen. 3 would be the drop-off zone, and 6 would be the resident courtyard. One of the things that we heard in the last conversation and with the city is that we are encouraged to maybe funnel down and make the crossing from the front door to the drop off a little bit more defined. And so what we're doing in the scheme here is really kind of necking down and providing a vegetated strip between the multi-use path and the drop off sidewalk to really kind of concentrate where pedestrians go. And then we're adding a secondary, more direct pedestrian route that gets us to that intersection that again is protected by landscape. Next slide. Tamara, I didn't know if you wanted to talk about the facade at all here.
Well, this is the view that we showed the last time, where we sort of heard that maybe our entry was just a little bit minimal compared to it being sort of our front door. So we wanted to show that, and this was also the before that we showed last time. And then this is as well a different view, sort of from the bird's eye. And again, just sort of this is what we showed before. And so, yeah, Ian, I guess I'll continue here. We
Sure.
just thought, wow, we had actually heard from the neighbors. How about adding some color? That they see this sort of coloration in a lot of projects around the city, and that they'd really like to see just a little bit of vibrancy near the entrance. So we actually pulled out these pillars here a little bit farther. We extended the roof canopy so that this isn't just like kind of a little bump, but it actually expands all the way across. And we created a covered seating area for folks to wait for their Uber or other things to pick them up. And then I'll let you, Ian, explain the other changes.
Sure. So you can see how we're really directing the crosswalk in a smaller footprint across the multi-use path. We have our drop-off area with the sidewalk there, and then the path continues to the right, kind of nestled in landscape. And then one of the other comments that we heard in our intro session was trying to understand the interface between the public plaza that's along the parkway and the resident courtyard that's into the building. And so our concept, our design vision is to have an evergreen hedge that basically follows the fence line. We want it to be well buffered and screened, but not to be a hard edge. So the idea is that we have this kind of architectural green that is sort of a crisp line that separates the public from the resident area, and then in front of that really crisp hedge we have our sort of extended grove and our naturalistic landscape as a counterpoint. This is an enlargement of the Soldiers Field Place side. Again, you know, we kind of described the elements here. One of the comments that we received in the first session was that, is there anything we could do to green up the cul-de-sac? And so I think if you go to the next slide, you can see that we are narrowing that down. We have a center section, which would be like a mountable curb and some cobbles so that larger vehicles could still get around. And then that central part, about a 10-foot circle, would be vegetated. I think that maintains the access that we're going to need to provide.
Yep, and this view shows as if the sort of hill wasn't here on the left, the architecture as it kind of bends around to the lower level of Soldiers Field Place. This again was before, and you could see the commentary of sort of how do you find the door to this side. We had maybe been a little bit too minimal about it. And so zooming in, we had this as a front door. Now this is an existing tree that we want to keep. And so our pathways kind of go around it. And there's our dog play area. And so again, just making a little bit more of it, taking some of this warm tone and making a frame for it, creating some color at that door, just sort of helps make it feel, you know, important.
And just under a minute left.
Yep. Okay. All right. So then we were asked, what about the pedestrian passage that comes from Soldiers Field Road between two permitted projects that are built or are almost finished? And here was the view from 44, where you walk through this little passageway. And right now on axis is our loading dock. So we thought, okay, we'll take a view here. We assume this is sort of a greened passage, and we have 2 loading dock doors. And one of the things that the community asked us was, could you find a place for some murals from Alston artists? So we thought that that might be a nice way to end this axis. So that's our proposal for that. And then the question of connectivity came up in the first meeting, really about, is there a way to get from the top slope to the lower neighborhood? And we did study 5 different options, and we presented those to the BPDA staff to be able to get from, this sort of 24-foot grade change. And here are some photos of what that looks like. Here are again some photos of what that looks like. At some point, it is actually this giant wall where the parking lot is above. And I'm going to hand this to Ian,
Great.
because this was the one that the BPDA or BPD chose.
That's right. Yeah, we found out on Monday that this was sort of the preferred version, and it's still very conceptual. I think there's a lot of due diligence that we need to do to sort of figure this out. But the idea is that there would be an accessible ramp, a series of ramps, about 360 linear feet to make that vertical grade change, that would come off the end of the cul-de-sac and kind of weave and wiggle through the existing trees up the very steep slope and get us up to that intersection. Because we are, really trying to preserve the trees. That's a big part of our design drive here. We're trying to minimize impacts there. And so the idea of using like helical piers or something that's as light on the land as possible is what we'd like to employ. If we can look at the next slide. So the 2 sections on the right show a couple ways that we could do this. The upper one is more of a boardwalk structure. The other would be maybe more of a poured concrete one. We think that's going to be too big of a footprint and be hard to maintain. I think for us, our concerns really have to do with the engineering of this and how do we make this seismically sound, structurally sound? How do we maintain this long term? It has to be, maintained for safety with lighting. We have to consider things like snow removal. And of course, we want to be able to preserve the trees. And so this is going to be an intervention that is going to put some stress on that existing grove. So we're in the process of trying to figure that out now, but this is what's been preferred by the city.
That's it. Thank you very much. And we are very open to questions or comments.
Can you go back to the site plan that has all of the spot grades on it?
This one?
That'll do, I guess. I just wanted to study this just a little bit more. I have a question about the Birmingham Parkway side on the left-hand side.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't talk about this alley of green that goes from 43 to 19 to 19.
Mm-hmm.
How does that work? What is in there?
So that's about a 15-foot wide setback. There's a few existing honey locusts there. As you get closer to the parkway, that red slope that we show on the right side actually exists on the left side as well. So it's like a 2-to-1 slope that has some trees on it, but it's generally flat from the 19 out towards Soldiers Field Place. And our thought there is that we were going to green that up and just make it a really good buffer for the adjacent property.
Yep. So are you keeping the I'm assuming there are existing trees on that? Is that right on that slope or not?
There are a few on the slope, and then there's some that follow literally right on the property line.
I'm just going to go back to the
Maybe the
earlier plan.
Okay, thank you.
Either this one or this one. Which do you
the
prefer?
one before.
Yeah.
The one before.
Yeah, that's good. I see.
So the darker green are existing trees.
Right.
The yellow would be removed because of the foundations.
Yep.
And
So-
what that is buffering, Laura, sorry, is
Go ahead.
the parking, right? Which is down there at the 19 level.
So go back to the slide where you had the concept of being in the woods, embedding in the woods.
Do you mean maybe the sketches?
It was very close. There you go. So, you have such an unusual site for the city, right? And it's a remnant of what used to exist along the Charles River, right? I mean,
Correct.
You've got that slope going down, right? That used to, if you had a string, you could sort of see what the natural topography was. before that. And that's so unusual. And I'm so happy that you protected that, because I think that it really holds the corner and also starts to make that connection that you're doing with the boardwalk going down as well. But I wonder if there isn't a way to better embed other parts of the site so that it feels like you're reintroducing and strengthening that sense of embedment within the topography and the planting, right? Because the thing that makes up the woods that you've identified is both topography and planting. It's not just one thing or the other. So the central courtyard kind of feels like you've erased that, right? Like it didn't exist. And if we could now go to the images that show the views into that courtyard.
Sure.
So and as you're finding that, I'll just say, so the idea, just get a check here. The idea is that is an area for the residents, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Right. It's not a public space. The public space is outside of that.
That's right. And likely there may be a pool or something sort of right inside that. So we wanted to buffer that well and have it be, private.
Yeah. Is that why you need the fence? Because it may be a pool?
Yes.
Okay. Because I'm kind of wondering whether or not, dare I draw? Hang on a second. There you go. So I'm kind of wondering, in this courtyard, I'm going to do a cross section looking that way. If you might not think about, this is the courtyard. If you might not think about doing topography in either a wall on the other side or just bringing that grade down so that this front space feels like it's held and that you really are making a space for the public that is just as interesting. And in fact, what you're doing here, wall or grade, is you are actually providing that bank back down for them as well. So that you get a chance to have a wider green that maybe can start to imitate.
Oh, interesting.
That kind of density of the trees here. Like there's not really much reason to leave that space open. Why not densify it? Why not make it have and work to be work on both sides of those spaces, right? So that each of them feels whole, so that they're not really just separated by a wall. By a fence. And if you needed, you could add a rail to the top of the wall to keep that 4-foot change that I know you need to surround pools. But it kind of, brings back maybe some of the stone that might be embedded on the, it can be any material, but I was thinking, what if it's stone and it, does it have a bench in it? But is there a way to really make the front work hard and feel like you've kind of really carved the building out of that landscape?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think the other side of this on a technical level is that I believe the garage below kind of extends under. So we do need to gain some vertical anyway, right, to get over the structure. So maybe that's a good mechanism to do that as well.
Yeah, no, and I wonder if, you need some of that, just like take a journey around the building and see whether or not there's a place that you can start to densify the trees, and so maybe you don't necessarily have to split this space with a small one, a small bed on the other side, but sacrifice some of this to make this thicker, for instance. Because we know the vegetation just is miserable in the city. It just is. It's going to get salt and it doesn't have enough soil. And, so I would just kind of take a journey around the building and see how much you can add that would bring back that sense that this whole thing is embedded in landscape.
Mhm.
And likewise on the other side, I didn't look at that as much.
And Laura, just while we're on that, I guess if I'd ask the proponent team, is the bikeway on your property or is that part of the DCR improvement?
I
It
was
is,
gonna ask that too.
yeah, it's partly on our property.
It's
because
half
of
on
the-
and half off.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because of the drop off kind of pushes a little
Yeah.
bit into it. You can kind of see here that black line, that arc is the property line.
Okay, so this is
Right.
something that we can sort of indeed look at.
And I wanted to ask, since you're working on the site next to this, to the left of this, which
Mhm.
is what a great opportunity, right, to kind of bring those ideas across. So what is just generally, what is the idea for that, and how does that connect? If we're looking at context, how does that connect to this property? Is there a plan, a bigger plan that you could speak to that?
There is a
There you
larger,
go.
yeah, there is a larger plan. I don't know if we have it in the slide deck, but basically it's a 12-foot wide multi-use path. It'll be asphalt primarily. And
one.
it's going to kind of be parallel to the road diet that's happening they're basically taking two barrels of the traffic and turning it into one. And then they're adding a green strip and adding this multi-use path that's kind of parallel and meander through this open
Yeah.
space.
So it's gonna feel like it's pulled through your site.
Yes, yes.
And then that park, is that recreation or some other use?
It's recreation. It's DCR. It'll be mostly lawn with some new shade trees and preservation of trees. And then there's an existing bocce court that's going to get refurbished by DCR.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
pretty low key, traditional.
Yep. And then if we could go to the new and improved or brand new boardwalk that goes across that slope. Boy, that is a tricky one, isn't it? And
Yeah.
I think your instinct to kind of keep it in a very light structure is actually better in the sense that when you're in it, you're going to feel like you're floating in the trees and above the trees, right? So that it's a much different experience than if you have something hard next to you, like the other, scheme that you were talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, of course, this will just disturb so much, whereas you can just rest lightly on the ground. Is that handicap accessible? Is that what that is? Ramps and landings?
Yeah, that's what we're struggling with the most, frankly, because it's a series of 1 and 12 structured ramps. So it's pretty daunting for a non-able-bodied person, even though it may be code compliant. It's a lot of vertical grade change to ask someone to surmount.
Yeah, and I was gonna suggest that maybe you have pull-offs on
Yeah.
that for, I know this is a really early scheme, but think about a pull-off where you actually could stop and, look at the landscape as well. It's not just for those who need like me, who would need a rest.
For sure. Yeah, we did every so many landings. We did a little bump out. It's kind of hard to see on the red, but that was what we were getting at there. And one of the other comments we received from the staff is we had shown this sort of intermediate stair that would get you off.
Oh, got it.
Halfway.
Yep.
They recommended that we don't do that.
Yep. So, so maybe in your path, you might think about, can you make actually a pull off that's not just an extension of that, but, this is obviously going to be at a different level than this, but maybe it's a way to kind of have a more gracious pull off and like you're hanging in the landscape sort of. And you don't need that many, right? You're going to judge how often people need to pull aside, And then one other thing I wanted to ask is about all of the patios around. So you didn't talk much about that. So those are patios for the bottom floor, and like,
Yes.
is the motivation there just that you know, bottom floor is always hardest to sell, so is this helping that, or is this like, what's the idea behind those?
Well, that is part of it. Certainly like what we've heard from a lot of our projects is that folks with dogs especially love these units, right? Where you have a lower floor terrace and you're on the ground floor and you can actually get from there to a little grassy area.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really primarily it.
Okay. And again, think about maybe trees in that area as well, even though it's you know, the courtyards are south facing and they're still gonna need some shade in that, and I'm
Right.
sure you'll do studies about that. One thing about the dog area on the back, and I am an absolute dog lover, a little unhealthily, healthfully, if the truth be told. But I would think about, like, can you introduce some topography in there? Can, you know, like, what will help kind of separate the small dogs from the big dogs, and
Mhm.
you know, just make it more interesting for them as opposed to just something flat. And then
Mhm.
my last comment is, you can just leave it right here, is this. I'm wondering if you can, and I know you have to do templates, but I'm wondering if you can look at a shape that maybe pulls out a little bit more so that you
With the
actually,
traffic flow, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I
so
see what
that like this is the way you go around, right? So this isn't cutting it off, but you also get a little more green to look out on, right? If that's extended a bit. So that's all I got for you.
Thank you. We needed landscape input, so that was fantastic. You're talking about that one,
Yeah,
right? So you're saying maybe make it sort of a little bit more of a
yeah,
keyhole shape.
yeah. I mean, I don't know what
Teardrop.
I'm drawing, but
Okay. Okay. Other
Bill?
comments?
Yeah, let me just very briefly compliment you, Tamara, on a really nice project. And I just want to applaud the kind of clarity of thinking that leads to a simplicity in form making that in all places very thoughtful and nuanced. And it's a brilliant project, and I hope we can
Thank you.
approve it soon enough.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Coming from you, that always means a lot, Bill.
Oh, don't say that.
Yeah, I would echo that. I appreciate the rigor, the simplicity, but the impactfulness of the architecture. I think one thing to keep pushing, I think the entry could still use a little bit more. I think that's maybe your one moment where you can have a more meaningful exception from the kind of core diagram you have here. But again, I think that's something that I have confidence that can be further developed. But in that one moment there, maybe there's more of that sort of green on that wall. But it could be something more to just really call that out from the field you've created. But again, that's something I have full
Jonathan,
confidence in the development of.
I'm glad you said that because I was feeling like I was going to be a little bit nitpicky because I really think this project is great. But what's interesting about what you've done with the entry piece here and at the rear is that you've made this wood panel have form instead of just being a flat panel. You're very rigorous that it's a flat panel everywhere except at these entries. And for me, it feels uncomfortable because especially it's going to be like a phenolic panel or something, and like the seams aren't going to come together convincingly. I don't know if it just should
Oh,
be,
interesting. Okay.
I just don't, I just wonder if it should just be the dark metal panel or a dark, brick. I just,
Oh, interesting. Yeah, we
the
could try
the
that.
three-dimensionality of those wood
Uh,
panels seems
Yeah,
uh-huh.
that's a great point.
wrong.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, maybe we could make them more thin walls that come out and they're gray. That could be great so that you have like three of these just
Yeah.
kind of planes.
Yeah. And if you go to
Okay.
the back image on Soldiers Field Place, you have that darker base that I think is pretty successful here, and you didn't carry it to the front. And these are all your choices, but I feel like that lands the wood panel better.
Mm-hmm.
Mm,
On the side.
Okay.
yeah, no, I think it's super, in terms of the architecture, I think it looks great.
Okay, commissioners, are there any more comments before we open up for public testimony?
I mean, the only comment that I'll say is I think that boardwalk, it's a lot, but I do think it's essential in order to get the connection. And we did see that in a chat through a public comment. I don't know if that
I'll read that
IAG
into the
measure.
record.
Yeah. And so, while it does seem like a lot and, a complicated detail, I do think it experientially will be a very, very nice thing to have as an amenity for the residents along this whole area.
Let me add, Tamara, that you mentioned these little nooks on all the units for home people working out of their homes. And so you'll have to share that with all of us, your little secret.
I know. I don't want to. No, it's totally our secret. Because look at this. I mean, this was very, very early on when we did this very first study, and it was a whole bunch of boxes,
Yes.
right? And we really tried very hard to make this variety in the unit types where we could just scooch the living room and kitchen up and create a little nook behind it, right?
Yep.
With that little extra bit of tilt of the facade. So each unit, just does get that kind of interesting flair to it. So
Makes fun for the unit types.
surprisingly, I mean, if the fellow who is Swiss who designed the units with me on this project was here, he would say, like, it's amazing how few unit types there are that are put together like, a jigsaw puzzle to make this. So.
I think we're ready for public testimony, Seth.
Okay. Just change screen. At this time, we'd like to invite any members of the public in attendance who may wish to contribute public testimony to raise your digital hand, and I will call on you. If you're calling in by phone, dial *9 on your dial pad to activate the raise hand function and dial *6 to unmute yourself. Please state your name and any relevant project affiliation information. Please keep comments to 2 minutes. I am not seeing any hands, so I'm going to stop the live comment period and read into the record a comment made by someone who had to depart, Christine Variel, apologies if I got that name incorrect, who is a member of the IAG for this project. I have to leave early, so adding my comments here, I'm glad folks brought up the connectivity issues. I own at 21 Soldiers Field Place, and having a public connection from Soldiers Field Place up to the new Leo M. Birmingham shared use path and greenway would be crucial. As of right now, you have to walk up along the SFR off-ramp to the Market Street, Leo M. Birmingham Road, and on a roadside without a sidewalk to get to Leo M. Birmingham, where the bocce courts are. It's precarious and kind of dangerous. This is my main ask as an abutter, plus keeping as much of the pickup, drop off, and deliveries off of Soldiers Field Place, as the road is very congested already, mostly due to 1550 Soldiers Field Road not having any sort of loading zone available and cars illegally parking in their tow zone that is supposed to be pickup, drop off zone from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Actual enforcement is needed on the street to prevent the illegal parking. I call 911 for tows nearly every morning. And that will conclude our public testimony. So I turn it back to the commissioners for next steps.
I mean, I will say that the architecture, I feel like we, are there, but Laura, not to point all fingers at you, that most of the comments are going to be around landscape. Is it something that you feel like we need to see again before it goes to full commission, or what are your thoughts?
I honestly think that if these comments can be relayed to staff that they will be incorporated in. And it's really just a matter of kind of looking more closely around it and pushing the idea of the embedment into the woods.
Okay,
So-
certainly. Thank you, Laura. We will take your comments and everybody else's comments, come back with the proponent to work through them. So hearing no additional comments at this time, and in lieu of a formal vote, commissioners, it's my understanding that the proposed project is recommended for final consideration and vote of recommendation at a forthcoming full commission meeting. And with that, I would like to thank everybody tonight. Thank you to the proponent for presenting and getting in the last minute walkway connection, as well as thank you, commissioners, as always, for your time and counsel and helping to make our design outcomes better for the city of Boston. Thank you, everybody.
Oh,
Good night.
And Mimi, please.
I hate to do this before we are about to hang up, but I am curious where we have that whole boardwalk and it parallels the easement, what that section looks like. So if you could just come with sections, I'm just curious about how tall that has to get because you're navigating so much grade. It might be interesting to see that.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that
And-
last request.
I mean, you might be able to negotiate the grade differently, right? You've just looked at A to B at the moment.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Seth, are we meeting in a week? Do we have
We
another
are
meeting in a
indeed
week?
meeting in a week.
Okay.
Welcome
Well,
to the holiday season
Yeah.
fun shuffle of dates. So appreciate as always everyone and look forward to seeing the commissioners next week.
Thanks,
Right.
everyone.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy
too.
Thanksgiving,
Bye.
everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.